Let's just dive in and talk about all the things I read in the month of September. First up is Dune Messiah. Now, in the August wrap up video, I talked about how this was not as enjoyable as the first book, and I still stand by that, but it is pretty decent. It's not like a terrible book or anything like that. Some people really rag on the sequels. I thought it was fine. It's a much more narrow scope, plot wise, and I don't know. It's quite different than the first book, but overall I enjoyed it. I'm gonna keep it in my collection. I'll probably reread it again someday, and it'll be an enjoyable read then too, I'm sure. My wife and I finished Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson, and we really enjoyed it a lot. We really blasted through the second half or so, or the last third or so. Really a lot of fun, much better than the previous two. There's this sort of like Indiana Jones feel to it. There's this temple that they go to. They're trying to find this mythical hidden treasure, and there's lots of action, and it was just a really good time. I liked it quite a bit. This is my second time reading it, her first time, and it was great. Of course, my family and I, we keep reading the Book of Mormon pretty much daily. We've been kind of lacking on that, but mostly we read a little bit each day. We read from Helaman 6, I believe it was, all the way to 3rd Nephi 11. And 3rd Nephi 11 is kind of the pinnacle of the entire book. It's when Christ comes to the Americas and starts to teach the people and establish his church. And it's a big focus of the entire thing. So it's really neat to get to read that and read it with the kids and talk to them about it, what it all means, and things like that. So that's been great. Along with that, I've been reading doctrinal commentary on the Book of Mormon, of course. We've talked about this one. Actually, I finished this book this month because this one only goes through Helaman. And so finished volume 3, and it was really good. I've talked about in the last couple wrap up videos. In this book, even when they're talking about things that I'm already familiar with, again, it's just nice to have a different perspective. Sometimes they explain things in new ways, and I like it. I finished listening to Golden Sun, which is the second book in the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown, and it was great. Again, this is my second time reading through the first trilogy, and I'm gonna go on after that to the later books, which I have not read yet. But anyway, again, same thing as with Red Rising. I've been taking it a little bit slower and just really letting myself sink into the world and appreciate it more, and I've really enjoyed that. I really, no spoilers, but there's a part where Darrow visit some people from his past life, and I enjoyed that quite a bit. And of course, that ending is really wild. I can't say anything about it, but it's part of the reason I think a lot of people really like Golden Sun. And yeah, it's real solid. I think I like Red Rising a little bit more. And the first time I listened to the trilogy, I liked the third book, Morning Star, more than any of them. And so I'm looking forward to moving on to that one. Matt over at Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, he did like a random wheel spin thing. People on his Patreon can choose books for him to read each month. And the one that came up for him was Old Man's War by John Scalzi. And I thought, I've been sort of in a whimsical mood lately, so I thought, heck, I'll just give it a try since I have this sitting on my shelf. And so I read this one, and it was a lot of fun. And it gets compared a lot to like Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein. I feel like those comparisons are somewhat appropriate, although this one's a lot more fun. Although I still enjoyed Starship Troopers more because I felt like Starship Troopers actually like means something. This one is just a lot of people call it popcorn, a popcorn read, and I think that definitely applies here. It's just a fun read, right? There's nothing really wrong with it, but it feels very surface level. There's not a lot to it. Very creative. I like the whole concept of like old people when they retire on Earth, they can join the military and then they have to leave Earth and fight in this intergalactic war, but they can never come back to Earth. And they're with modern technology or whatever, they're able to overcome the effects of aging, and that way, they have soldiers who have a lifetime of experience, but they are still able to fight and all that stuff. I thought the alien cultures and the alien, yeah, cultures, just the different races that they encounter and species, I thought those were all really interesting, but that's about as far as it went. The first two thirds, I thought, this is fun. I'm not going to continue the series. And then after that point, I started thinking, actually, this is getting pretty cool, and maybe I do want to read the sequels. But then by the end, I had kind of reverted back to my original thought. So I think I'm just gonna move on and not read the series. I've heard they're not as good as the first book anyway, so that's okay. Anyway, so that was Old Man's War. It was pretty decent. Next thing I read, pretty certainly the best thing that I read this month. This was The Saliva Tree by Brian W. Aldiss, and I read it in this collection, Man in His Time. Best SF stories of Brian Aldiss. I could talk about the story for like half an hour. I'll try to keep this brief. It is written as an homage to H.G. Wells. It was actually written to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of Wells's birth. And so it's written in his style, and it's a very Wellsian kind of story. A really fantastic story, just super awesome. This alien object falls to Earth. Main character goes to investigate it. It's on this farmer's land. The farmer is busy trying to like harvest his crops and save his farm that he's kind of struggling with. So he doesn't even care. He's like, "Don't talk to me about this weird stuff that you think you're finding or whatever. I'm busy, like whatever." Also, the main character is sort of in love with the farmer's daughter, so there's all this like subplot, and it's just really fantastic. It turns into a horror story. I was not expecting it to become horror, but it definitely is. It's really good. I was expecting more just sci-fi, but it does get pretty creepy at a few points. I can't say enough good things about it. It's just really, really, really top-notch story. I read the entire thing in almost one sitting. I read like the first 5 pages or so, and then I wasn't able to continue. And then later, I sat down with a chance to actually read it, and I read the remaining 75 pages all in one shot. And I hardly ever do that kind of thing. So it was just incredible. Great story. The Saliva Tree tied for the Nebula Award for Best Novella in 1965, the very first Nebula Award. And the story that it tied with is the one that I read immediately after, and that is He Who Shapes by Roger Zelazny. I read it in this collection, The Last Defender of Camelot. And this one, unfortunately, I didn't like nearly as much. In fact, I didn't really like it much at all. There were a few positive aspects to it, but mostly I felt like it has some interesting like sci-fi trappings. It's got self-driving cars. It's got video calls, and keep in mind this is like in the mid 1960s, right? It's got genetically modified talking dogs and interesting, fun things like that. But I felt like a lot of those sci-fi trappings kind of distracted from the plot, and it felt muddled. I kind of didn't get what was going on sometimes and why things were happening. This guy, he's like a psychiatrist. He's called something else. I can't remember the phrase they use for it. But basically, he treats his subjects by hooking them up to this machine along with himself, where their brains he creates these like dream scenarios, these fantasy realities for them to enter into, and he can see what they're seeing, so they're kind of in there together, and he treats their neuroses in this way. And really fun premise, really cool. But again, I just felt like it just didn't quite work for me, which is a shame because I think a lot of people talk about how great this is. This was expanded later into a novel called The Dream Master, which I have a copy of here, so I'll probably read that one of these days. Hopefully, in the expanded form, maybe some of these things will be explained a little bit more and it'll just kind of flow a little bit better. I don't know. Mostly, I thought it was okay, but just not much better than okay. Both the Saliva Tree and He Who Shapes have like multiple layers, right? Where there's like metaphors, and you can tell they're trying to say something a little bit deeper than just the surface level story. But the difference is the Saliva Tree is a fantastic story on the surface, while He Who Shapes, it's like if you don't get all these metaphors and things, then there's not much else there. And unfortunately, I'm just not smart enough to understand all the things that he's talking about in this story. It almost felt like the first few Terry Pratchett books that I read. It's like I can tell there's a joke happening here, but I don't get what it is. That's how I felt with this He Who Shapes story. It's like, yeah, I get there's some sort of metaphor, there's some sort of deeper meaning, but like it's going over my head. I'm not smart enough. So I just didn't end up liking it all that much. I've been doing a lot of traveling recently for work. This is a little bit of our busy season. And so everything else that I read this month, at least everything that I actually finished, was audio. So the next thing I listened to was A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. This is 16 short stories in a collection. And a few of these I thought were really great. Some of them are pretty poor. I don't know. Actually, I don't think I would call them poor. They just weren't to my liking. Very description heavy, like almost no dialogue, not a lot of real plot, just a lot of description. So that's fine if that's what you like. You can see how Tolkien was inspired by some Dunsany, and then everything else was kind of in between. Like it was fine, just not fantastic. But I just wanted to talk about the 2 or 3 stories that I really liked in this collection. Where the Tides Ebb and Flow was really great because it surprised me. So the narrator apparently did something terrible, and so after he dies, he's not allowed to be buried so that his soul can never find rest. And this one turned surprisingly dark, which I think is why I liked it so much. It's like part fantasy, part post-apocalyptic sci-fi because his soul is still dwelling around even like hundreds of years later. Every time somebody finds his bones and buries them, somebody else who knows that he's not supposed to be buried, there's like this secret society tracking his bones. Every time they get buried, they go and dig them up so like he can't be buried. And it was a little bit weird, but it was just kind of a fun story. I wrote part fairy tale, part apocalyptic sci-fi, part horror. Very good. Now, the story Beth Mora, this one is really interesting because I actually didn't like it very much, but then it's going to come up later. Um, I wrote, I don't really know what this is about. Half of the story is spent describing the nighttime in London, various aspects of the countryside, and a place called Beth Mora. Then some messengers come to Beth Mora, and some calamity occurs, and the city is destroyed or something. Like, that's what I got listening to this, and I didn't really understand what the heck was going on. But then later on, there's a story called The Hashish Man, and it's very meta because Lord Dunsany, he's a character in the story, and he says, I went to dinner, and there was this hashish man who told me that if you take large quantities of hashish, you can like your soul can leave your body and you can go to the dream realm or whatever. And this guy that he's at dinner with tells him what happened to the city of Beth Mora. He's like, "Oh, I read your story, Beth Mora, and I saw that you didn't understand what really happened. So here's what really happened." And it's this cool little like Inception type situation almost. I know that's not the proper way to use Inception. I'm sorry for you Christopher Nolan purists out there. But anyway, so Beth Mora, I didn't like it, but then it ended up being a really cool part of this other story, The Hashish Man, and that was great. I liked Idle Days on the Yan, just a guy like on a riverboat going down the river and like experiencing different things along these different towns and stuff along the river. The Sword and the Idol was really good. It's during the Stone Age through a series of like just coincidental factors. This guy accidentally creates the first sword, and so he kind of brings humanity out of the Stone Age and into the Iron Age. He becomes the leader of his tribe because he has this unbeatable weapon, right? But he does have his enemies within his own tribe, and this other person creates this religious idol and starts telling the people what the idol says. When really it's just him making it up. This one did have sort of a deeper meaning. I feel like I don't know, that's the thing about interpreting stories. Like I never know if I'm doing it right or not. I think this one has is making commentary about like brute force versus the power of words kind of thing, or just like physical power versus religious power kind of thing. Overall, it's a cool story. It's like an interesting sort of fairy tale thought experiment almost in a way. Uh, but yeah, I liked it. My favorite story in the whole collection is called Poor Old Bill. And I just wrote here an old sailor tells about his crew's efforts to stage a mutiny and kill their captain, but the captain won't go down easily. I really, really liked this one, sort of like Pirates of the Caribbean. Part of it is pretty dark. So they betray their captain, but then the captain puts a curse on them. They're unable to come to land. And I don't want to tell too much, but they don't have food to last them all this time that they're stuck out on their boat. So they start eating each other. There's some cannibalism. And so you can see the parallels and how Pirates of the Caribbean, who knows, may or may not, the writers may or may not have read this story and gotten some of that material from there. Or maybe pirate curses are just such a common part of mythology or folklore that they got it from there. I don't know. Next up, The Phantom of the Opera. I listened to this one sort of to get ready for spooky season. I was looking for things to listen to, not quite ready to move on to Morning Star. So I was in the LibriVox app. I forgot to mention the A Dreamer's Tales. I listened to that in the LibriVox app. You can listen to it for free there. It's in the public domain, as well as The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. And I really ended up enjoying this one quite a bit. It does have a few minor horror elements, so it was kind of good getting ready for October. But mostly it's a romance, some fantastical elements, and a little bit of comedy as well. Like I really like the mix. It changes tone. It's a little bit epistolary in a way. There's certain parts that are like different characters tell their part of the story, and so the tone does sort of switch. And and overall, I just liked it a lot. I've never really known what the Phantom of the Opera was about. I saw the movie when I was a kid, but I don't remember anything about it other than there's like one really good song. And then after I read the book, I actually did go back and I ended up watching the movie like right after. And the movie was fun. It was really interesting to see how they took a lot of stuff from the book. Like most of the stuff in the movie is right from the book, but they changed the order around quite a bit, and they do adjust several other things. Uh, make it different for the movie, and it was interesting to see how they did that. So anyway, really good. I would like to get a physical copy. Honestly, I would love to read the original French. I'm not too bad at reading French. I've read a couple books in French before, so if I ever find a French copy of The Phantom of the Opera, I'll snag that up if it's affordable. After I finished The Phantom of the Opera, again, I was looking to kind of get into the spooky season. It was toward the end of the month, and so again, I didn't want to start the next Red Rising book. I wanted to just listen to some spooky things, so I was browsing around the LibriVox app and I found this collection. So LibriVox, in case you didn't know, all the stories are in the public domain and they're read by volunteers. So sometimes they'll have all these various volunteers just read short stories and then they'll just slap them all into a collection. So I listened to this thing, or at least I started it. This collection called Short Ghost and Horror Collection number 34. And a few of these, I don't know why they're in there because they have nothing to do with ghosts or horror, but none of them are bad so far. I've listened to five or six of them. So I listened to At the Gate by Mila Jo Closser, which was kind of a cute story about a dog. The Background by Saki. The Background is a great one. Saki's a great short story writer, of course. The Background, this guy, he inherits a small sum of money and he spends it all on a huge back tattoo. And he learns that there are unforeseen consequences, unintended consequences to having a famous work of art tattooed on your back. And he ends up uh, just dealing with a lot of nonsense. And I thought it was a really clever story. I listened to Banshees by Elliot O'Donnell. Between the Lights by E.F. Benson is not a bad story. The Case of Vincent Peerwitt, I like that one, by Barry Payne. Um, very sort of straightforward classical ghost story. Nothing really special about it, but it's very well done. This guy, David Peerwitt, his name is, oh, Vincent Peerwitt, sorry. Vincent Peerwitt was his name. His wife dies, and friends and family come over to the house to like help him or whatever. He's grieving. They have a dinner, like a wake situation. They're having this dinner and the phone rings. So the narrator answers the phone because the husband doesn't want to, and the narrator hears the voice of the wife, who is dead, saying something. And then I won't tell you more than that. It's actually a pretty solid story. I liked it a lot. It's very short, so go check it out by Barry Payne, The Case of Vincent Peerwitt. The next story in that collection was supremely messed up. It's called The Dualitists, or The Death Doom of the Double Born by Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker, of course, is very famous for writing Dracula. And this short story, it started almost kind of whimsical and funny. There's like these two boys, and they're good friends, and they are gifted matching pocket knives. And they, of course, start like chopping up everything they can find and like whittling and carving the furniture and stuff. They get bored with that. Then they start arguing about whose knife is better, whose knife is sharper, whose is stronger. So they start like slamming them together to see which one has the stronger blade. And but they get bored with that, and then it takes a pretty dark turn. Well, not yet. It's still somewhat playful. They start doing that with other objects that they can find. They start smashing them together to see what breaks, which one breaks first, which one is stronger. And you're like, oh man, these troublemakers, they get the servants in trouble because like they think the butler is breaking the spoons or whatever. I can't remember exactly. But then they get bored with that and they move on to doing it with live things, with animals. And so it's really messed up, and it gets worse from there. It does not have a happy ending. It's super, like, I'm not kidding when I say it's very messed up. It's actually pretty gross. Anyway, overall it was just really it's well written, I could say that, but it's really crazy, really crazy story, especially from a modern perspective. Like I feel like maybe people just weren't as sensitive back then. Listening to it now in 2024, I'm like, I can't believe anybody would think of this, let alone write it down, let alone publish it. And but there you go. Now I mentioned I did do some traveling, and on a couple of these work trips, I did take the family with me. So we finished How to Be a Pirate by Cressida Cowell. This is the second book in the How to Train Your Dragon series, and I think I liked it even more than the first book. It was a lot of fun. There's like a hidden treasure, and they have to go to this mysterious island, this dangerous island, and there's booby traps and all kinds of stuff like that. And of course, it has a lot of silly humor that is perfect for like elementary age school kids. So it was great. After that, we listened to Junie B. Jones and That Meanie Jim's Birthday by Barbara Park. This is, I don't know, like book 6 or 7 in the series, and it was fun. Junie B. Jones books are actually quite a bit of fun. Again, if you have young kids, especially young girls, but even my boys liked it, so it's a fun story. And I actually, surprisingly, it had a surprise ending. There was something at the end that I did not see coming, and yeah, so it was fun. After that, the last thing that I actually finished this month was The Magic Finger by Roald Dahl. We listened to that as a family while we were driving, and that was I've read it before, and it was good. It's like extremely short. It's really a short story, but it's an illustrated book if you read it in print. So it's like 40 pages long or something like that with illustrations and everything about a little girl who doesn't like the fact that her neighbors are avid hunters, and she puts the magic finger on them and kind of puts a curse on them. And it was kind of fun. Okay, that's everything that I actually finished in the month of September. We've got a handful more to go. These are ones that I'm still currently reading. I'm still working on them. Captain Underpants and the Revolting Revenge of the Radioactive Robo-Boxers. We're, I don't know, about halfway. Yeah, about halfway through this one. Reading it with the kids. Haven't been home at bedtime very much this month, so we haven't made a lot of progress. And what can I say? It's Captain Underpants, so it's awesome. I already mentioned we're reading the Book of Mormon, and so haven't finished that one yet. We're still reading it. And I moved on to volume 4 of Doctrinal Commentary on the Book of Mormon. This is going to be 3rd Nephi through Moroni. So this is the last one. It goes all the way to the end of the Book of Mormon. So I'll be reading this one all the way to the end of the year. I guess I never mentioned the authors. This is by Joseph Fielding McConkie and Robert L. Millet. Volume 3 is by those two. And this one is also by Brent L. Top. They have a third author that joined them on this one. So it's good stuff. Religious commentary. I like that kind of stuff. My wife and I started The Lost Metal. This is the final Wax and Wayne book in the Mistborn series. This is number 4. And we're about a quarter of the way through at the moment. Very surprising beginning to this book. I won't say anything in detail, but just characters are in different places than I expected them to be. There's a bit of a time jump between book 3 and book 4. And so, yeah, just not what I was expecting. And nothing big has happened so far. There's been a little bit of action. It's fine. It's good. We really like the first chapter, or the prologue, actually, I think it was. It's from Wayne's perspective when he was a kid. That's a lot of fun. And I'm excited to see where this goes because I've heard that there are tons of Cosmere connections, and this is one I have not read before, so my wife and I are both experiencing it new. I've been reading just a little tiny bit of The Science of Nutrition, and I think I'm on page like 15 or 20, so not very much. Just learning a little bit about macronutrients, protein, fat, carbohydrates, learning a little bit about fiber, and that's it really. And lastly, this is the one that's been taking most of my reading time the last week and a half or so. I mentioned I was gearing up for spooky season. I've never really done themed reading before, but this year, I don't know, I just felt like it. I said, "Hey, I'm gonna tackle some of these big classic horror books that I've never read before." And first on the list was Dracula. I actually just got this copy a couple of months ago on a Whatnot sale, so I was excited to dive into it. I've mentioned on this channel many times that I'm a big wimp. I've never really watched any scary movies. A couple, but not really. And so I've never seen any Dracula movies, and I've never read the book. I don't know what it's about. I thought the entire book took place in Transylvania. Like that's what everybody talks about Dracula about, it's he lives in this castle in the middle of nowhere in this forest or whatever. And that's only like the first few chapters, 4, 5, 6 chapters. After that, should I say? I don't want to spoil anything for people out there like me, but I'll say it. Dracula, he moves to England because he's looking for more victims. So he moves to London because there's millions of people there that he can prey upon, and it's good so far. I'm about halfway through at the moment. Where's my bookmark? Where's my bookmark? Oh, I remember. I fell asleep reading last night, and I totally, but I'm like around here. I'm right around page 200. Anyway, sorry. It is a much slower book. It is, it's a little bit older language, and I don't know if I should say I'm having trouble getting through it, but to be honest, I haven't picked it up in a couple of days. It just hasn't really been calling to me, but I'm going to power through. I want to hopefully finish this in the next week or so I can move on to a few other things. And let's talk about those right now. So on the TBR for October, again, I mentioned I want to read a bunch of like classic horror things. So I'm going to finish Dracula, and then I'm going to pick up The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I've got a copy here. And again, it's one that I've been looking forward to for a long time. and I'm finally going to do it. It's very short. The next one is very short as well. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. I'm looking forward to reading that. So those should not take me that long. And then after that, if I have time, which I think I will, I'm going to attack It by Stephen King. That's my next read in the Stephen King read along. Anyway, readathon, sorry, the Stephen King readathon. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it. I don't know if I'll actually have a chance to finish it by the end of the month because it's over 1,000 pages, but those are all the books that I plan to read in October. Along with those, in between and here and there, I want to scatter in a few spooky short stories. So I'm probably going to focus on like Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, maybe some M.R. James, and some Algernon Blackwood. And anywhere I have a chance to sprinkle those in, I'll probably read a handful of those. Oh, and of course, to be read in October, I'm going to read a few chapters of Words of Radiance. I did not crack this open a single time in September. I have not read a single chapter in over a month. I don't know. I just haven't. Sorry, I've been busy. And so I haven't made any new Stormlight Archive chapter recap videos either. And I know most people on this channel are here for that. So I'm gonna get back into it, I promise. All right, if possible, I try to do my monthly reading wrap up and my monthly book haul video together in one, and I try to keep them under half an hour, but that usually never works out. I think I maybe talked a little too much.